Well, hi there, everyone. Rabbi Leah coming to you with Hi There with Rabbi Leah. Just wanted to say hello. Good Tuesday morning. And if you are watching this and you have friends who uh, aren't able to watch it this morning, make sure they tune in this afternoon. Okay? So, we started our discussion last week about Pesach. And needless to say, just doing 3 or 4 half-hour sessions is really not doing the holiday justice. Although I would venture to guess that so many of you are so knowledgeable about this holiday because of all the Jewish holidays, including Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Pesach, Passover, is the most widely celebrated Jewish holiday. And even those families who consider themselves secular and don't necessarily have a ritual Seder will nevertheless sit down with family or friends for a Seder meal. This year it might be a little bit different. Last year at this time, I'm just thinking back to a year ago, we had just gone into quarantine. Families were not being allowed in the building. Um, Guests were not being allowed. I ended up doing the Seder via live stream from my home because I just couldn't fathom standing in the synagogue by myself and doing the Seder. And a year later, here we are. It's just an amazing thing that we have been enduring this now for a year. God willing, though, we are beginning to see the light. We are beginning to round that bend, and just hoping that people continue to be safe so that when we say next year in Jerusalem, it'll be a reality that we could actually go to Jerusalem next year. So last week I spoke about the ritual that we do known as the collection of the chametz, biur chametz. It is an opportunity for us to clean out our lives, clean out our homes, get rid of the schmutz, get rid of the chametz, and start anew in the new year. And although we won't be changing to 5782, Nisan, the month in which Passover falls, on the 15th of that month, is the first day, the first month of the new Jewish calendar. So it is one of the 4 Jewish New Years. I mentioned to you that the first Seder this year is on a Saturday night. When that happens, we do the chametz collection not on Friday night because it's already Shabbat. You're supposed to do it the night before the evening of the first Seder. So under normal circumstances, that would be Friday night. But because it's Shabbos, we can't walk around the house with a candle, scooping pieces of bread or crackers or whatever into a paper bag to burn the next morning. So the halacha, the tradition or the law tells us that we have to do the chametz collection the day before, which would be Thursday night. Unfortunately, I'm not going to come to campus and schlep you all around in the dark on Thursday night. So we will be doing it on Friday morning. But traditionally, it's done on Thursday night if the first Seder is on a Saturday. So here's a trick question. If the first Seder is on a Saturday evening beginning at sundown, and we have to collect the chametz on Thursday night, what do we eat all day Friday and Saturday until the first Seder? So we've collected the chametz Thursday night. We now have to get all the way through the entire day Friday and almost the entire day Saturday before we sit down for our Seder. So what do we do over that almost 24-hour period from the time of the collection of the chametz to the time of the Seder itself? Not an easy question. But of course, the rabbis and the Talmud have an answer for that. And what they say is that after you have collected your chametz on Thursday night, you hold back a certain amount of not kosher for Passover food, along with specific dishes, utensils. You can use paper goods and so on, so that you can have regular meals. Now, you're not going to be cooking them in your kitchen. Maybe you would prepare them before and keep them in a separate refrigerator that's out in the garage or in a basement if you live back in the East where they have basements. But you are permitted on those 2 days to eat regular food because it is not yet Passover. The real challenge is to make sure that neither the food nor any of the utensils, pots, pans, silverware, and so on that you're using mix in with the kosher for Passover implements and food. And it is a challenge. So we are dealing with that this year at Seacrest. And by the time you watch this video, we'll have figured that out. And I'll be able to report to you on it the next time. Now, every year at Pesach, I get very similar questions. Why do we have to do this for 8 days and not 7 days? My family never celebrated 8 days of Passover, only 7 days. Why are there certain foods that are not kosher, but other foods that are kosher? How do I know the difference? What does it mean for something to be kosher for Passover versus kosher for the rest of the year? So these seem to be questions that repeat themselves each year, but I think that's a good thing because learning something several times really helps you remember it. So I'm going to be touching on some of these things now. I want to start by reading something to you that was printed, let me figure out how many years ago. This is 5781. This was printed in 5769, so that's 12 years ago. And this is what is known as a responsa. Actually, that is the plural. The singular is responsum. This is a question that is sent to a group of rabbinic authorities. In this case, it happens to be a group of Reform rabbis who have a committee. This committee is met for 100 plus years, obviously not the same members on the committee, but for quite some time. And they address questions of import to the Jewish community. So responsa literature has been around for many, 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 many years. And depending upon the group of rabbis who are the authorities answering the she'elah, the shaila, the question, you're going to get varying opinions. And obviously, each group thinks that their opinion is more valid than the others. But they're all based in halakha, in Jewish law. It's how that law is interpreted that gives us the different answers. So I'm going to read the question to you because I think it's quite interesting. And it actually came from a rabbi who I know, Rabbi Lawrence Englander in Mississauga, Ontario. And yes, there are Jews in Mississauga, Ontario. It's outside of, not far from Toronto, I believe. And here is what he writes to the committee. Now, understand that when this responsa committee gets a question, either from a rabbi or a layperson in a Jewish community, they may or they may not answer it. It's kind of like the Supreme Court. They may get a case which they don't feel warrants their attention, and so they won't hear that case. And usually what determines that is the breadth of the number of people for whom the answer is going to be important. So, for example, when it comes to the Supreme Court, they're going to hear issues of civil rights justice. They heard the cases on same-gender marriage and so on and so forth, which was passed, I think it's at least 5 years ago, this past June, if not more, but at least 5 years. So they will look at one of these questions that comes to them, and then they will determine whether or not addressing this question and bringing the answer to the Jewish community will have an impact on the greatest number of people. So they're looking for questions with quite broad scope. And here's the question that was sent by Rabbi Lawrence Englander. What should be the standards of Pesach Kashrut for Reform Jews? What foods should be prohibited? What is our position regarding rice and legumes, which are known as kitniot? And we'll talk about that in a moment. How do we deal with the requirement of biur chametz? Biur chametz, the destruction of the searching, the destruction of the chametz. Do we destroy our chametz, sell it, or put it away? So I would imagine that in 57, 56, which was 20, what did I say, 22 years ago? 23 years ago. No, 25 years ago. That the rabbis on the Responsa committee probably read this and said, this is a good question. This is going to impact, the answer may impact several thousands of people. And the reason I chose this one today is not because we are all Reform, not because our practice is homogenous. As you know, we have some people in our community who are not Jewish. We have some people who were raised in strictly Orthodox homes who are now secular. They don't consider themselves to be at all religious. We have some people who have converted to Judaism. We have others who are Reform, but they consider themselves relatively religious, that they do practice. But I wanted to choose this one in particular to give you some insight into how the rabbis come to the conclusions that they come to when a question of this sort is brought to them. And so the question that Rabbi Englander is asking is, does Reform Judaism have any standards for kashrut during Pesach? Because so many people think that Reform Judaism is just Judaism light, that anything goes, and that's not at all the case. So what does Reform Judaism have to say about kashrut for Pesach? What about those certain foods that are eaten by certain groups of Jews? The Ashkenazi Jews generally don't eat kitniot, the legumes and beans and peas and corn and things of that nature, whereas the Sephardic Jews, it is part and parcel of their diet, and so it's not something that's given up. How did that all come about? Why is it that if you saw peas on your plate or baked beans on your plate during Pesach, you might turn your nose up at it and say, this is not kosher for Pesach, when indeed, in certain communities, it absolutely is kosher for Pesach. So we're going to explore this, but we're going to try to get into the minds of these progressive modern rabbis to see how they answer the question that Rabbi Englander has sent to them. Okay, so the first thing we want to understand is why this rabbi asked this question, and it's probably because he had congregants come to him and ask him, we know what the halakha says, we know what the Talmud says, and we know what the Jewish law would say about keeping kosher for Passover, but specifically, what does Reform Judaism have to say? And so the answer to this question is called the teshuvah, the answer. The question itself is called the she'elah. And this is what the committee said. These questions have been dealt with in brief in Gates of the Seasons, which is a publication that came out from the Reform movement, one of a series of volumes published in recent decades. that testified to a renewed interest in ritual observance among Reform Jews in North America. So, evidently, studies had shown at that time that there was this resurgence in an interest by Reform Jews in engaging in more traditional type rituals around holidays and so on and so forth. For many years, questions of ritual observance were deemed to be matters of personal choice and did not rank high at all on the communal agenda of the Reform movement. That situation, of course, has changed. Today, we acknowledge that an authentically Jewish way of life requires ritual as well as ethical expression. So, for many, many, many years, the Reform movement, early on in the mid 19th century, when Reform Judaism first came to the United States and was growing in Germany and in Western Europe, what we saw was a move away from anything that smacked of ritual or tradition. So there was no more keeping kosher, there was no more wearing a tallis, there was no more wearing a yarmulke. Congregations and Reform Jews moved away from bar and bat mitzvah to confirmation and so on. But the pendulum swings, and the pendulum of Reform Judaism swings. And so that sometimes the pendulum will be to a very conservative side, conservative with a little c in terms of its practice. And other times it will become much more progressive, meaning less ritualistic. Early Reform Judaism kind of threw the baby, the bathwater, and the bathtub out all at the same time. People no longer kept kosher, anything goes as far as food, and so on and so forth. But around this time, the Hebrew year 5756, and we are now in 5781. So 81 minus 56 is 25. Did I get that right? I think I got that right. So 25 years ago, we kind of began to see this renewal in terms of an interest in ritual. And so that change brought about a focus more on ritual practice than on what the Reform movement had been famous for or known for, so to speak, for many decades, and that was work towards social justice and issues of ethics and social justice. And now we're seeing this move back to a more of a focus on ritual practice and what do we or they as Reform Jews do. Now, I'm using this as an example not only to discuss kashrut, but additionally to show you how rabbis work through some of these questions. So this could have been done by a conservative responsa committee. This could have been done by an Orthodox responsa committee. And each would come up with their own ideas and recommendations depending upon their level of practice. Okay, so today, Reform Judaism perceives ritual practice as a mitzvah, a matter of central religious importance. Much pioneering work has been done, particularly in the published works mentioned above, in describing and setting forth the principles and details of Reform observance. So, Reform, as I said, doesn't just mean you do what you want to do. Reform Judaism has tenets and practices, and it is that to which they are referring here. And some of the works that they're talking about are Gates of the Seasons, a Shabbat manual, Gates of Mitzvah, Gates of Shabbat, and so on and so forth. These are the books to which they're referring to in this particular paragraph. The task of this teshuvah, this question or answer on Pesach observance, is therefore not so much to issue a ruling as it is to supply the background and discussion necessary for an understanding of the practice of Pesach kashrut in the Reform movement. So, this is what you have to understand about this form of rabbinic discussion, and that is that they will come up with recommendations, but not policies. So when they send this back to Rabbi Englander in Mississauga, Ontario, and publish it in books that have these volumes that have dozens of different responsa materials in them, it doesn't mean this is what you have to do, because there is no dogma, there are no policies. These are what the committee believes the practices should be. Then it is incumbent upon you, and I don't just mean you, but it's incumbent upon one to read this, to understand it, to figure out how they got to these conclusions, to try it on for size, and then to say, you know what, it doesn't work for me, or yeah, it works for me pretty well. I think I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do this, and so on. Some people will keep strictly kosher for Passover, but anything goes in their home the rest of the year. Treif galore. Some people will have a kosher Seder, and then the next day, that's it. Not another piece of matzah or non-chometz item in their home for the rest of the week. So there's a very, very broad continuum of practice, particularly in the more progressive Jewish movements. Okay, so what they do now is they're going to go back to the original writing in the Talmud and what the Talmud has to say, and then they're going to discuss that and see if indeed that is a form of kashrut to which more progressive Jews can subscribe. So in the Talmud, we read about this in the Babylonian Talmud, in Psachim, which is the tractate on Passover, on page 35a. Is that specific enough for you? And this is based around, it says, according to, based upon a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 3. So there's something before the Talmud, and what's before the Talmud is the Mishnah, and what's before the Mishnah is the Torah. And so they go all the way back to a verse in Torah, and that verse says the following. It mentions both the words chametz and matzot. And we are going to be reading all about that in the Haggadah in just a couple of weeks. And there is a principle in reading narratives and stories and parts of the Talmud in which we compare certain things. It's called a hekesh. A hekesh. It is it's a way in which we compare different things in literature. And this particular comparison, the rabbis deduce that only those grains that are chametz, that undergo fermentation, may be used for matzah. Okay? So, now we get into a whole different ballgame here, because this chametz is considered to be rice and legumes according to this particular tractate in the Babylonian Talmud. It is a mitzvah to abstain from eating leaven. Leaven is described as any agent which either ferments or causes something to rise, like yeast. That's a process of fermentation. It is a mitzvah to abstain from eating leaven, chametz, during the entire 7 days of Pesach. And by chametz, the tradition means those grains from which matzah may be baked. So, if you can make matzah from the following grains, you have to restrain yourself during Pesach. And what are those 5 grains? They are wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. Okay, spelt is another grain that can be ground up, made into flour, can be fermented, and so on and so forth. And this is why the traditional matzah, even though it's made out of flour, from the time the flour is ground until the time that piece of matzah comes out of the oven is exactly 18 minutes. Because the rabbis knew that the fermentation process could potentially start after that time from adding water to one of these grains. And if you think back to when your kids or grandkids were in grammar school and they used to take little lima beans or some sort of a legume and put it in a wet paper towel or in a little pot with some wet soil, and that thing would sprout almost overnight. And so these 5 grains, wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt, are the 5 that are forbidden for consumption on Passover. No other foodstuffs are regarded as chametz, so anything else goes. In this, the Halacha rejects the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, who forbids the eating of rice and millet during Pesach because they resemble chametz. So along comes this Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri, and he says, nope, you can't eat rice and you can't eat millet either, because if you grind up rice and if you grind up millet, it might look like one of those other grains, and you might confuse it. So stay away from anything that when ground up might ferment and become chametz or might be confused for something else. Okay, so we don't want to eat anything that resembles wheat, spelt, barley, rye, or oats. Talmudic law rather forbids the use of rice and legumes, kitniot, as flour for the baking of matzah, but permits us to eat them during the festival. So here's where some of the confusion comes in. People say, oh, you cannot eat beans, you cannot eat peas, you cannot eat legumes, and so on. But that isn't what the Talmud tells us. The Talmud says you may eat those things. What you may not do is take those items, dry them out, grind them up as flour, and make them into matzah. That is a huge distinction. That is a huge distinction. So the only 5 things you may not eat are wheat, oats, barley, rye, and spelt. Anything else you can eat, including rice and legumes, as long as you don't make them into flour and make matzah with them. So now that I have you thoroughly confused, we're going to continue this discussion next week. Again, I encourage you to send me your questions. I know you're going to have questions. Hopefully, I will answer them during the course of this discussion over the next few weeks. But if not, I would love to have your questions so that we can all benefit from them. And I promise not to make up the answers. If I don't know the answers, I will definitely research them for you. So that's the end of today's Hi There with Rabbi Leah. I want to thank you all for joining me. If you have friends in the buildings who are not watching this, tell them to tune in. so that I don't have to say, if you'd watched my video, you'd know the answer to that question. In the meantime, I'm going to say Lahitra Ot, bye bye, and thank you so much for joining me. Bye.